So I figured it out. Everything is wrestling. Now don't worry, if you don't watch wrestling, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about wrestling in this video. And it's actually pretty simple. The only background on wrestling you need is that wrestling is like 50% super impressive like acrobatics and fight choreography and 50% soap opera. So even if you don't know anything about the soap opera, when you first start wrestling, you're just impressed by the people doing backflips on top of each other and like jumping off of something onto another guy without hurting him is really hard to do. I mean, don't try it, but like if you did, everyone involved would get hurt. And so you watch it at first just for the fights, right? But then eventually you get caught up in these stories that have lasted years and years, and they're really complex, and all these characters have different relationships. And the only two rules you need to know about wrestling are that whatever's more interesting is always what happens in wrestling, and that everything is wrestling. And the wrestler I want to talk to you about right now is a guy named the Iron Sheik. The Iron Sheik was around in the 70s and the 80s. And the Iron Sheik was this guy who was from like Iran and also like communist Russia for whatever reason, because we were scared of both of those countries and we had just almost had a war with them, and maybe we're going to have a war with them right now. And he would come out, he was this big fat guy, and he had a communist flag, and he would wave it, and he would get into the center of the ring. And he'd be like, fuck you, America! America's terrible! Fuck you! Iran is great! Russia's great! And we'd be like, fuck you, Iron Sheik! Fuck you, America's awesome! And a guy literally dressed as the American flag would come out and he'd just beat the shit out of the Iron Sheik. And we'd be like, yeah! And it was awesome. And he did it week after week after week. But here's the thing about wrestling. The heels, now that means villains, right? And he was a heel, are way more interesting than the good guys, right? So when you think about the good guys of wrestling, like The Rock or John Cena, they're just good guys that are there to stop the bad guys, right? They're just good guys that are there to make sure whatever the bad guys do doesn't happen, right? And that's really super boring. But when you look at the bad guys like The Undertaker, who's an undead wizard, or Batista, who can talk to snakes, or the crazy guy who had the sock puppet, like they're super duper interesting characters. And so because of that, the Iron Sheik started to get fans, not because anybody supported what he said, like fuck you America, but because he was so much more interesting than the guys who are dressed like American flags. And that's what's happening with Donald Trump right now. Donald Trump is the ultimate heel. He's the ultimate villain, right? He's this crazy billionaire. He's actually been on wrestling as Donald Trump. He's this crazy billionaire, and he's just a super racist, and he's stupid, and he comes out and he's like, fuck you, Mexicans! You're all a bunch of rapists and murderers! And we're all like, fuck you, Donald Trump! Mexicans have it really hard in this country. They're gonna be the majority in a little while. How dare you say that, Donald Trump? And he's like, fuck you, Muslims! There shouldn't be any Muslims in the country. And we're like, fuck you, Donald Trump! It's really hard to be Muslim in post 9/11 America. And he's just so much more interesting than the good guys. And when you think about it, that's why we spend all our time on him, right? And he does all the things that heels do in wrestling. He makes fun of handicapped people. He hurts ladies. Like, he comes on the news and he's like, oh, Megyn Kelly's got blood coming out of her vagina. And we're like, don't you know what he says that about ladies? And that's what we do in wrestling. We're like, get her, get her, get her. And we want to root for Megyn Kelly for the first time ever in like history, right? Because he's so fucking terrible. And he's so much more interesting than the good guys, right? And he's got this ultimate tag team partner, right? Because he's a crazy rich billionaire, and he's racist, and he's totally stupid, and we hate him. But now he's got Mike Pence, who's this evil Christian governor from Indiana, who created a law so crazy against gay people that even the NBA was like, that's a little bit much for us. And he doesn't believe smoking causes cancer. And he thinks that fetuses should have funerals. And he doesn't think global warming's real. And it's just the ultimate tag team, and it's so much more interesting than anything the other side has going. And look, I know, some of you are way smarter, and you'd be interested no matter what. But imagine just for a second it was Hillary versus Mitt Romney. How much less interesting would that be? I mean, it'd be better because we wouldn't have like a supervillain that might be president, but it would be so much less interesting. And what's interesting is what happens in wrestling, and everything is wrestling. But here's the part that's really important. There's a reason why I brought up the Iron Sheik at the beginning. See, in 1979, by the time it gets to 1979, the Iron Sheik has lost over and over and over again. He's this big fat guy. There's no chance he wins. He constantly loses, and he always comes out and does the same thing, and the same thing always happens. But he's so much more interesting that in 1979, he's got more fans than the good guys do. And because of the rules of wrestling, in 1979, he wins the World Wrestling Championship. Because he was so much more interesting. And what's interesting is what happens in wrestling, and everything is wrestling, because right now we have the two most interesting presidential and vice presidential candidates of the last, I don't know how many years, it's just true, versus this good guy who we don't really know a lot about, right? It's Hillary, this guy she just picked for a vice president, who knows who he is, right? We're like all desperately Googling him and being like, hey, he seems okay. But she's just like a good guy who's there to stop the bad guys. And we're not even sure that she's that good a guy, because something about emails and something about Benghazi and also a bunch of money and something about Bernie and maybe she told everybody DNC and blah, 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 blah. And it's too much information to take in. All we know is that she's the good guy and Trump's the bad guy. And everybody says there's no way Trump will win. There's no way Trump and Pence will ever win. Even though it would be way, way, way more interesting if they won. And don't get me wrong, the Holocaust is interesting. You know what I'm saying? But it would be way, way more interesting if we won. And the only two things I need you to remember why I'm so worried right now is that the most interesting thing is always what happens in wrestling, and everything is wrestling.